we're going to talk about birds. And I really, really like birds. And I was going to just do one class about birds, but there's so much information I want to tell you guys that we might have a 2 or a 3-part lesson about birds. So I hope that's okay. So we're going to do our introduction today. We're going to talk about the origins of birds, and we'll talk about some dinosaurs. We will talk about the feathers in their form and their function, and then we'll go over our activities and cover some resources for you guys. So today I would like to reintroduce myself to you guys. I think everyone on the call has been here before, but I'm Megan, and I'm Aiden and Lizzie's mom, and I work at scientist.com, and I absolutely love science. And Aiden and Lizzie might know this, but one of my degrees is in agricultural sciences, and I did poultry science. And poultry means like chickens and turkeys and birds that we raise for food. So I actually have a degree in birds. And I used to raise chickens and stuff. I really love bird watching. So that's why I'm going to share all about birds with you guys today. And you know this part, we're talking today because you're out of school, your moms and dads are still working, but you still need to learn. So I'm hoping to help. Okay, now on to the fun part where we're going to talk all about birds. So we're going to talk about the origins of birds. And origin just means where something came from. So ornithology is a word that some of you might have heard before, but it means the study of birds. And anybody can study ornithology. So if Lizzie likes to watch birds, she can say that she's an ornithologist. But it's also possible to go to school for ornithology, and I actually took a couple ornithology classes. And so I have this big old heavy textbook about ornithology, and I actually really loved it. And I also took a lab class where we learned how to watch birds and look for them. So anybody can study ornithology, even if you're like me and you didn't go to school specifically for it. So the thing about ornithology is that it encompasses the study of birds, and birds are defined in a couple different ways. But one of the cool things about birds is that they're conspicuous most of the time. Conspicuous means obvious. So they're kind of all over the place, right? And they're mobile, so they move around all over. And they're found everywhere. You can probably step outside your door right now and see or hear a bird. And they're also very variable, which means they're very different from each other. So they can be really, really big, or they can be really, really, really small. And they can be very bright and interesting looking, like these sun conures that are in the top right corner. Or they can be kind of dark and bland, like this kiwi bird in the bottom right-hand corner. Or they can be kind of sneaky and camouflaged, like this great horned owl. So they're very, very different, and they are all super different from each other, which is very interesting to me. So there's been a lot of people that have studied ornithology in the past, and I could go on and on and on and tell you all about them, but I'm going to tell you about a couple famous ones. So the first one on the left here is John James Audubon. And he was born in 1785 and lived through the 1800s, and he was an American ornithologist. He was also a naturalist, meaning he loved to study nature, and he was a painter. So a lot of people know him because he did a lot of studies documenting all the types of American birds that he could find. And he illustrated and painted them for his book, which was this huge, huge color-plated book called The Birds of America that came out in the early 1800s. And it's actually one of the first books about birds or ornithological works that has ever been completed. And he also identified 25 new species of birds, which is very impressive. So there's a foundation in his name, the Audubon Foundation, and they do a lot of work even now with the environment and with birds. The one in the middle I wanted to point out because she's a very influential woman in ornithology, and she's also a naturalist. Her name's Rachel Carson, and she wrote a book called The Silent Spring, where she talked about how pesticides were harming not only the environment, but birds. So the pesticides were being ingested by birds and actually causing their shells to be very weak. And so birds like condors and eagles and things, when they went to sit on their shells to incubate them, the shells were cracking and breaking, and no new babies were being born. It was a really big issue. So Rachel Carson is actually one of the biggest advocates for the environment and a great revolutionary in her time. So she lived in the from the early 1900s to about the 1960s. And then finally, this guy on the right here, you can see this is more of a recent picture. His name is David Allen Sibley, and he's another American naturalist, and he has written a bunch of really good books. And I have probably 3 or 4 of them out of, I think I have about 30 books that are about birds on my bookshelf, but this is one of my favorites, and it's a little bit old. You can see it's getting kind of yellow, but you can see it's the Sibley Guide to Birds. And it's a field guide, and this one's actually for Eastern North America. So this one covers Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, where Audrey lives. And I have another one for the West Coast. But this guide, he did all these cool illustrations, and each one covers different species of birds and tells you what they look like and where they live and what their habits are. So you might have a cool guide like this for if you're going out to look for birds. So he is one of my favorite ornithologists. But people have been studying birds for a very long time, and they've been interested in them for a really long time. And they're actually symbols in a lot of different cultures and have been for a super long time. So if you see the little black and white picture there, that is Ba from the Egyptian Book of the Dead. The copy of this picture is in the British Museum, and it actually was a symbol of the mobility of your soul after you die. And it's often depicted as a hawk with a man's head. So besides being symbols of religion, birds can also mean an omen. So like a sign of something that's going to be coming soon. They can also be symbols of countries and states. So you might see birds all over the place if you look. The dove in the bottom there is a really common symbol of Christianity as the Holy Spirit. The raven, the big black bird there, is actually a symbol in both Hindu and Norse mythology. And it because ravens are smart, they are often considered guides for people, and they were also generous. And then finally, the cool guy on the right-hand side there is Quetzalcoatl, and he's a Mesoamerican deity. So Mesoamerica is like Mexico, the Incans and the Mayans, right kind of to the south of us a long time ago. And he was actually a god who was a feathered serpent, and he was the wisest of all men. So people have been looking at and studying these birds for a long time and incorporating them into their daily lives. So I was wondering if you guys know a bird that's a symbol of something that you see all the time. Aiden?
On like a bunch of TV shows or something, a vulture is usually what was it again?
An omen of death?
Yeah.
Yeah. Does anybody else see a bird on maybe a flag that you know of, or something like that, or a seal or a crest? Any guesses? You guys might have seen the American, or the eagle, the bald eagle, on a lot of symbolism for the United States. And the bald eagle is actually the national bird. Fun fact, Ben Franklin thought the national bird should be a turkey. He fought to have it as a turkey because he thought that eagles were kind of sneaky because they eat carrion and animals that are already dead sometimes, and they might steal that meat. So he thought that turkeys were more noble, and he thought the national symbol of the United States should be a turkey. So instead of being bald eagles, we could all have turkeys on our shirts right now. Be silly.
That bird should be the place called Turkey. That should be their mascot.
Yeah, that would be silly.
And the eagle is a symbol for freedom.
Also very good point, yes. So you guys might be wondering what actually defines a bird. So some of these symbols that we talked about, like the Quetzalcoatl and Ba, are actually kind of hybrids. So like one is a bird man and the other is like a serpent bird thing. So what actually makes a bird a bird? Well, birds have a couple things in common. So they're all vertebrates, which you guys might remember from a previous lesson means that they have a backbone or a spine. They're all bipedal, which means they walk on 2 legs. They all are feathered, and they all have bills instead of like regular mouths with teeth. So bills mean they have kind of like a toothless appendage that sticks out, and they use that to eat and stuff, but having no teeth is part of having that bill.
Why was there like writing popping up on the screen like that?
Oh, I have no idea. Okay, so birds and reptiles actually have a lot of things in common, which I think is kind of not as well known. So there are some similarities, and I took this picture of a figure in my textbook, so sorry it's not super clear, but they actually have a couple things that are in common. So they have a lower jawbone that has several bones in it, and it's articulated. And they have a single bone in their middle ear, which is interesting because we have lots of them. They have an expanded lateral brain case, meaning their brain, instead of going up kind of and around here like ours does, it actually expands towards the back. So they have kind of long skulls. And they also have this ring that supports their eye and their eye movement. So people noticed things like this a long time ago, that there were similarities between birds and reptiles. And they finally realized that actually birds are really closely related to reptiles. And they're really closely related to Rhea's favorite, dinosaurs. So if you look millions of years ago, and as we are getting closer and closer to now in the blue here, some of these dinosaurs have a lot of differences to birds, and some have very few. So you can see dinosaurs are evolving that have 4 digits in their hands, and then they suddenly have hollow bones like birds, and they're getting closer. Now they're getting hollow and cylindrical feathers. They're getting tufted feathers. They're getting longer arms. And then finally, towards the end here, see if I can get this to work. There we go. If you zoom in, they have a toothless beak, a fused wing, and short feathered tail, like living birds. So if you look here, as their bones are elongating and they're evolving into birds, one of our friends here is called the Archaeopteryx, and this is my favorite dinosaur. So the Archaeopteryx is really cool. This is a fossil that was found. It's one of the first that was found. This fossils of Archaeopteryx started being found around the time that Charles Darwin wrote The Origin of Species. And what's unique about this fossil is that you can actually see feathers. So it's really uncommon for things like that to be preserved. Usually it's only the bones. So it's really unique that we saw these feathers, and you can see it has a long feathered tail, and it has these feathered wings or forelimbs, and then you can see the head kind of got fused, or it kind of got fossilized in a weird position. So the head's curling down here, but you can see the beak. And this helped us really realize that birds evolved from little carnivorous or meat-eating dinosaurs from the late Jurassic period. And I was really excited to tell you guys about Archaeopteryx because it was considered to be one of the kind of links between birds and dinosaurs. And more recently, we found some other birds that are also really closely related, or other dinosaurs that are also really closely related to birds and have feathers. So this is what Archaeopteryx looks like in an illustration. So I thought this was pretty cool because a scientist that also does some design work went ahead and drew out what they thought the Archaeopteryx feathers would look like. And obviously we have no idea what the colors would be, but it kind of looks like a little velociraptor with feathers, doesn't it? So it's a cool intermediate or midway point between birds and dinosaurs. There's also another dinosaur that we think is closely related to birds, and that is the Compsognathus, I think is how you say that. I haven't heard anybody say that, but this was actually a little tiny dinosaur. It was only 2 to 3 feet long, so it was maybe the size of Ava's puppy, just a little tiny guy. And you can see a rat or a mouse for scale here. And it was actually, it's actually thought to be also really closely related to birds. Finally, there's this funny guy, I think Longisquama, maybe. Dinosaur names are hard to say, but this is a cool fossil. And you can see they found some of these like feather-like appendages. And so they're not exactly feathers, but you can see they're coming up from the back. And these dinosaurs were closely related. They think were in here with the early reptiles, crocodiles, and things like that, that eventually, or some of these groups eventually became birds. So they have feather-like structures, but they're not actually true feathers. So the coolest part about this, dinosaurs evolving into birds, is that it happened really, really fast as far as evolutionary timeline. So if you pretend dinosaurs are in here in the middle of this circle, they all of a sudden basically exploded into all of these different kinds of birds. And we have a huge, huge variety of birds today. So over the course of like, I think maybe 10 million years or something, they evolved really rapidly. And if you zoom in, you might see on one part of that, we get to chickens. And you might remember that I said that chickens were very closely related to the T-Rex. So there's a bunch of other different kinds of birds on here we will talk about, but the chickens and the turkeys are actually pretty closely related to dinosaurs, which I think is quite silly. So now I'm going to tell you about another defining feature of birds that I get really excited about, and that's feathers. So there's actually a bunch of different kinds of feathers, which we don't really think about, right? Because if we see feathers on the ground, they're usually like wing feathers and they kind of all look the same. But there's a few different types. So there's actually the wing and the tail feathers that look pretty similar. There's down, which you guys might have heard of down being used to fill like comforters or coats to keep you warm. And it does the same thing on the bird, it keeps them warm. There's contour, there's semi-plume, there's these really funny ones called bristles. And those are usually on the face. They're just kind of, they almost look like little hairs. And then there's phyloplumes, which have these little tufts on the end. So if you find a feather on the ground, you might be able to compare it to one of these pictures, because there's actually a bunch of different kinds of them. So downy feathers, like this puffy guy, they actually look fluffy because the little spokes that are coming off of the feather aren't really arranged really tightly. They're loose. And so they're also flexible. So what they do is they're kind of like, you know, loose and fluffy, and they're trapping air. And they trap that air close to the bird's body and help keep them warm. And that's why when you have down in like a jacket or a comforter, it can also keep you warm. Pennaceous feathers, which is the word for the ones that we're most used to seeing like on the ground if you find a feather, they actually are more arranged. So you can see how these are kind of wild hairs that are kind of flying around. These actually have barbs and barbules, and they interlock together. So if you find a feather on the ground, you might be able to slide your finger up and help lock some of those barbs and barbules back together and make it kind of stiff and flat. And those feathers are actually allow the bird to stay dry, and they allow them to fly as well. They're very important parts of the bird. And most birds have both types of feathers. They might have downy feathers underneath and these pennaceous feathers above, or maybe they have them in different sections of their body. But the coolest thing I think about feathers is the big variety that they come in. And remember, we talked about variety means differences. So there's a huge group of feathers that all look very, very different and do different things. And I want to show you just a few of those varieties. So check this out. Because feathers are all kind of considered one part of the bird, but they actually come in a really, really diverse amount of forms. So they're all made of the same structure, which is beta keratin, and they're made of the same basic parts. So they come in a big stalk that then branches out, but they all do that a little bit differently. And so in really complex feathers, sometimes they have barbs and branches, and sometimes they're puffy, and sometimes they might have like a long center part that then branches out, like the ones I showed you before. So there's actually a lot of very different feathers that you can see. And up here you see a hummingbird that's showing us some tiny, tiny iridescent feathers. So iridescent means that it can look a different color depending on the angle that you're looking at. Here's a female northern cardinal. We've got a peacock that you guys might have seen before, and you can imagine these feathers in the tail are very highly specialized. So they're not like wing feathers that help them fly and they don't help them keep warm. They're actually made to look pretty.
I know what the next bird is.
This guy?
The little guy with the fuzz? Yeah.
What is he?
It's a kiwi.
Yes. It's one of my favorite birds. I actually wrote a paper about kiwis in college.
He's so fluffy.
He's very fluffy. And kiwis are actually in Rhea's animal book too. So Rhea might know about kiwis. These are wood ducks. So you can see there's a female that looks a little bit more plain and then a male. And then this is a great blue heron. And these are actually feathers coming off the back of its head. So you can see feathers have a lot of different shapes and colors and purposes. And we're going to talk a little bit about what those different purposes are. So you remember I said form and function. Well, form describes how they look, and function describes what they do. So now we're going to talk a little bit about that. So one of the main functions of feathers is actually for flight. And this is a roseate spoonbill. So I actually got to see one of these one time when I was in Florida, and they have a bill that's shaped like a spoon. I saw it from way down below, and it was flying above with its funny shaped bill, and I was pretty excited. But their feathers out here that you can see are actually pennaceous feathers that allow them to fly. So each feather on the bird's body is a structure that serves a really important purpose. And the feathers that allow these birds to fly also help them stay warm and keep dry. But these ones are for efficient flight. And so there's primary and secondary wing feathers. So you can see the primaries are these long ones around the outside, and then there's another layer, the secondaries. And because the sun is shining up above this roseate spoonbill, you can actually see these different layers from below, which is pretty cool. But unlike other feathers, the primary and the secondary wing feathers, these really big, strong ones, are actually anchored directly into the bones on this spoonbill's arm. So wing feathers that are anchored to the bone have ligaments also, so that they can withstand some of the really strong forces that go into flying. The primary ones on the outside are the longest, and they are on the kind of outer half of the wing here, and they can be controlled and rotated by the bird. So because they're in the bone and they have ligaments, they can actually turn them almost like fingers, and it provides most of the bird's thrust, so that pushes them forward. And the secondaries can't be controlled as well, but they help provide a lot of lift for the bird to fly. Also important to this are the tail feathers. So those are also considered flight feathers because they help the bird steer. And the two central tail feathers are actually also attached to bone. So another cool thing that feathers do is they help the bird display. And so some of these feathers are so highly modified for this display that they almost don't look like feathers at all anymore. So like this guy, this bird of paradise here, if you see these two little dangly things coming off his tail, those are actually feathers. Even though they look like strings with little discs on the end, those are really highly modified feathers. And you can see this duck here. I think this is it's either a wood duck or a mandarin. It's a wood duck. You can see they're iridescent and they're very wispy up here and very beautiful. And those are specifically for displaying and calling in other mates. So the males are saying look at how strong and healthy I am. Let's make baby ducks. And so these displays are really important because they can show how healthy that bird is, because if the bird's not doing well, its feathers aren't going to look great, right? Another interesting thing that they do is not just look pretty with color and shape, but they allow the bird to kind of show off their feathers. So this one on the head of this jay, which is a blue jay, it's not super fancy, and he's not using it to say, hey, ladybirds. What he's using it to say is, hey, get out of my face. He's actually using it to be aggressive, and he's saying, grr, get out of my area. So usually they have their crests lower down and their heads are kind of smooth looking, but when they're being aggressive or there's another bird threatening them, they will puff up their crest. So a lot of times birds actually using their muscles can alter the way that these birds are. So they get elevated, kind of like if you think about when you get cold and all the little hairs might stand up on your arms and poke up. Birds can actually control that a lot better than we can. So they can make different feathers kind of stand up or look different depending on what they're doing. And so a lot of these birds have really, really beautiful feathers because they want to get noticed. But sometimes they have interesting feathers so that they're not noticed. And that is actually camouflage. So I bet you guys know about camouflage, and we usually think about it as being kind of drab, like it's brown or like light green and looks like their environment. So this one is also a bird that I think is super cool. This is in Australia, and it's called the common Potu. And this silly guy sits on top of stumps, and he puts his head up and he closes his eyes and he holds really, really, really still. And usually people don't even notice that it's not a stump. And if you see his little eyelids have these kind of little tiny triangles, he can actually see through those when his eyes are closed to know if a predator is coming. So he doesn't even have to open his eyes. It's pretty cool. The other one, this parrot, you might think, hey, that looks pretty obvious. I can see that parrot. But this parrot, the Eclectus parrot, actually lives in the jungle where it's very, very vibrant and green around it. So that green actually does blend in. And when it's foraging in the rainforest cavity or rainforest canopy, it's actually really difficult to see. So it's pretty cool that they can be really, really brightly covered, but still be camouflaged. Another cool function of the feathers is insulation. So if you see these super fuzzy little goose chicks or little goslings, oh, actually, I'm sorry, these are swans, little swan cygnets, they're called. These little guys are, when they hatch, they're covered in this like fuzzy coat of fuzzy feathers, and it's kind of downy. And that actually keeps them warm in cold water, especially. So once they get a little bit older, after a few weeks, they'll get rid of that down coat and they'll get an inner layer of adult down and an outer coat of those cool contour feathers that are all smooth that we saw. But sometimes birds that aren't precocial like these. Precocial means they hatch kind of ready to go and they can mostly take care of themselves. But songbirds and things like that, or robins, if you guys have ever seen a robin hatch, they're actually born completely naked and they don't have any feathers at all. So they can't really regulate their temperatures well. The other cool thing that feathers do is waterproofing. So this guy is a common loon. And if you look, the feathers on his head are so tiny and smooth, it almost looks like velvet. And across its back here, you can see some water droplets sitting there because this bird spends all its time in the water. It actually, when it walks, is really awkward because its feet are so like far backwards for paddling. And these feathers are arranged to be overlapping, almost like roofing tiles. So they only expose the waterproof tips of it. And these birds actually have a special gland, their preen gland, that's kind of by their tail. And they can use that. They dip their kind of beak in it, and then they take that oil from the preen gland and rub it on all their feathers to help keep them waterproof. And it's super, super important for them because if that water gets in, the bird gets waterlogged and it gets cold, and it's a big problem, especially if it's in the wintertime. So finally, the other function I want to tell you guys about with bird feathers is a bunch of other stuff. It can be really weird. You might remember this sand grouse from our desert animal adaptations class. He's gathering water in the feathers on his belly to bring back to his chicks to drink. But some feathers, like these on the great horned owl, we actually don't know what they do. So it's still a mystery. People thought that maybe that they helped them hear, or they thought it helped them display to other owls, but nobody's been able to prove anything either way. So there's actually still a lot of mystery surrounding some kinds of feathers. The other cool thing is that feathers can actually change. If you see this silly kind of naked, angry looking cardinal, birds actually do what we call molt. So about once a year, their feathers, because their feathers wear down over time, about once a year, they replace all their feathers. And to replace old feathers with new feathers, it means the new feathers have to fall out. So in the meantime, a lot of times the birds look kind of silly and they look kind of grumpy. So you can see this cardinal has molted some of the feathers on its face, and it's got a little funny naked face. And so if you have birds in your house, or you've ever seen chickens or wild birds, you might every once in a while see them looking a little bit silly like this as they're losing their feathers. So you can see here, this bird has gotten a brand new feather in the middle, and you can see the edges are nice and clean, and these old worn feathers are starting to look kind of beat up. Remember the barbs and the barbules we talked about, they're not locking together correctly anymore, and they're kind of ragged on the edges because flying is a lot of hard work. And so you can see that they're replacing it with nice new ones that will help them fly. Cool, so now we're gonna go on to activities. Is that a pig? I see someone has a pig. I love it. Okay, so now for activities, guys. For little kids, you can draw me a picture of a bird that you've seen outside. You can draw me a feather, or you can draw me a dinosaur that's a relative of a bird. For big kids, you can draw a picture of a bird and label what defines it. So like having feathers and a beak, those things. You can make a comic about birds evolving, or you can write a few sentences about what feathers are and how they work. Middle schoolers can write a paragraph. Oh, I left that out. Middle schoolers can write a paragraph, I'll fix this and send it to you later, explaining how bird feathers work. You can draw your own diagram of a bird, or you can create a comic about bird evolution. And then as always, you guys can email your homework to me. And I have a whole lot of resources here for you because I really love birds. Some of these might be interesting. Some of them might be a little bit advanced. And then the other source I used was this big old textbook that I didn't want to torture any of you with. So if you ever have any questions about birds, you can ask me and I will look it up in this big old book for you. Okay?